Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist, and I'm based in London in the UK in Harley Street. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Richard Reeves. Richard has published a very interesting book, which we're going to be talking about today, Of Boys and Men is the title, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why it Matters, and What to Do About It. But Richard, let's start by asking you a bit about yourself. Tell us a bit about your background and a little bit about your biography and how you came to write this book. And then we'll discuss the book itself. Tell us a bit about yourself first.
Sure. Well, I have to start, Raj, by saying that my first job out of college was at the Institute of Psychiatry, where I shared an office that was occasionally frequented by Dr. Raj Persaud. So as I remember you back then. There's no reason, as I think we mentioned in the pre-call, no reason you should remember me. I was sitting in there crunching numbers as part of postgraduate work. But I started there, and then I moved into think tank world, IPPR, journalism for a while, and then in and out of politics. Most recently, I was in the coalition government. I was Nick Clegg's director of strategy during the first half of the coalition, moved to the US in 2012, and have been at the Brookings Institution, DC-based think tank, public policy think tank, ever since then. And my work has really been mostly around issues around inequality, social mobility, and family policy. That's what led me, in the end, as well as being the father of 3 sons, to this concern about boys and men.
You said that we met back at the Institute of Psychiatry a long time ago, and you were crunching numbers. Because what's interesting about your books, and this book in particular, is you're very good on evidence, I think, and people in journalism are scared of evidence. And there's a lot of fantastic data in your book. So is there a link between your facility with evidence and the data that's in the book? Because you mount a very powerful case because you're very evidence-based, and like many people in journalism, and the fact you were crunching numbers back at the Institute, did you have a background in statistics or numbers in some sense?
Well, I've always been around social science, so I guess I could almost call myself a social scientist now, even though my training's actually, I ended up with a doctorate in philosophy on John Stuart Mill, as I think you know, Raj. And so but my work in think tanks and in government and so on has always been very empirically grounded, I would say. And to some extent, I think that goes back to the better version of journalism. After all, C.P. Scott, the founder of the Manchester Guardian, said, "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." And that's why the Guardian comment section was called "Comment is free." But people forget about the second half quite a bit. Facts are sacred. And I do think that too many of our public conversations are either grounded in bad facts or are floating free of facts altogether. And we should at least try to get a shared understanding. Okay, what are the facts on the ground here? And then let's have a discussion about the interpretation. What does that mean? How bad is it, etc. But I'm afraid that we are increasingly floating free of facts, especially if they're facts that challenge our priors, right? We don't like facts if they go against our previous view, whereas, of course, those are the facts we should be seeking out, the ones that challenge our priors. But that's become increasingly uncomfortable, I think, for people to do. And so what you get is just a slew of bad facts. You can prove anything on the internet. Everything's true on the internet. You've just got to put in the right search term. And so I was very determined in this book to at least ground the conversation about what's happening to boys and men in the best empirical evidence I could find.
So I want to get into the book, but I think you're making a very interesting point there about inconvenient facts. Because you're quite right. People don't seem to realize this. You can obviously find anything you want on the internet to prove your point of view. What you should really be interested in is the really inconvenient fact. But people aren't looking for that, are they? Because that's the real test of your belief system. But to be looking for the inconvenient fact for any ideas we have, you also have to be open to changing your mind. And that's a problem. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I'm John Stuart Mill's biographer, and so I'm just going to channel Mill, which is Mill said, all of us are walking around with falsehoods in our heads. We just don't know which ones they are yet, and the goal is to find out. And so we should, if we have the virtue of truthfulness, which I think we should certainly strive to have, then we should be seeking out the best version of the counter-argument. There's this nice phrase in the rationalist community now, which is that rather than a straw man, they talk about a steel man. So they say, I'm going to steel man the other side. And what that means is I'm going to take the best possible version of the argument against me with the best evidence, best constructor, and then see if my argument survives that, right? Because anyone can be a straw man. And I think just as intellectuals, as citizens, as people living in the world, that really is the approach we should try and take. The difficulty, as every critic of Mill and of liberalism has said ever since, is that is hard. It's much easier just to have, prejudices that you can easily support with facts you find on, TikTok, than it is to do the hard work of challenging your own assumptions. Because as you said, Raj, the ever-present danger is that you're going to have to change your mind. And changing your mind is a difficult thing for people to do. Just psychologically, that's hard for us to do. And in fact, apparently we get a bit of a dopamine hit from hearing someone in authority saying something we already believed. Because I knew that was true. And then you get this guy from, the Institute of Psychiatry or some, if you say it, then it's Dr. Raj Persaud say it must be. You feel really good, or a Brookings scholar says it. But of course, the purpose is not to feel good. The purpose is to try and get it right.
So you mentioned dopamine release there when we have an authority figure saying something we already believed. In other words, a large part of what people are looking for in authority and statistics, just a confirmation of your previous prejudice. So let's turn to the book now entitled Of Boys and Men. And you do, because you mentioned dopamine release, you do seem to be interested in brain science. So let's first of all set out the argument that men are in trouble in some way. And you may not want to start with the brain science, but you do write in very interestingly about men's brains developing later than women's brains as an empirical fact. You may want to start there, but you may want to start somewhere else. What's the evidence that men are in trouble?
Well, across 3 or 4 main domains, I think there are reasons to be worried about some men. Not all men. I think it's important to say that the specific focus here is on men with less economic power, less social status, are the ones who are struggling the most. So working class men in particular. In the US, where I'm based now, Black boys and men in particular. In the UK, I'd say it's more of a class story than a race story. But in the US, obviously, there's a big racial component. But in education, boys are falling well behind. That's obviously a relative measure, but way, way behind. So the gaps on college campuses, both in the UK and the US, are bigger now than they were in the 70s. They're just the other way around. So women caught up with men in college by about the 80s, just blown right past them, and are now outperforming them to a much bigger degree than men used to outperform women 50 years ago. And you can see it in high schools. You can see it in every every key stage that we get data for. And what's interesting is that the girls have really caught up in math and in many cases overtaken in some areas like math and STEM, where boys might be ahead, and they're way ahead in English and humanities. In the labor market, very sluggish male wages, declining male labor force participation. In family life, you're seeing fewer and increased number of men who are not in touch with their children. So there's a growth in fatherlessness in most Western societies, but particularly actually that one in the UK and the US. And then, of course, we see, I'd say, some of the results of some of these trends in very high rates of suicide, which are between 3 and 4 times higher for men than for women, and rising over the last 2 or 3 decades. So those are just a sort of scattershot, if you like, of different reasons why we should be concerned about those particular facts. And they do all knit together. Like boys who are struggling at school will struggle at work. If you're struggling at work, it's hard to form a family. And then one of the results of that is that you end up in trouble. And actually, one of the studies that I cite, it was published in the BMJ by Fiona Shand and her colleagues, looked at men who had committed or attempted suicide and looked at the last words they had used to describe themselves. And the top 2 words that men used to describe themselves before suicide were useless and worthless. And so I think to some extent what you're seeing there is a really sharp symptom of this sense of cultural redundancy that many men are facing. And many young men are just struggling, I think, to what does it mean to be a man now? And then underlying that, I think there are some biological differences, which maybe we can get into, but that mostly I think those are about the education gap. I think the education system is just neurologically more female friendly than male friendly.
You said neurologically. Let's talk a bit about that, because the stuff you were writing in the book about men's brains developing later than women's is very interesting indeed. And you have a proposal that men should go to school, I think, a year later than women. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So obviously the whole area of differences between female and male brains is a pretty hot one. There's lots of argument about that. And for what it's worth, when it comes to adult female and male brains, I think both sides in that debate somewhat overstate their case. On, if you like, on the left, there's this argument that there are no differences, which is just bonkers. But there's also just this argument sometimes that conservatives will, more conservative folks will make, say, there are these huge differences, and they explain why women can't be engineers. And so there's massively overweight these biological differences, whereas of course the distributions overlap. But where there's really no argument at all is the timing of brain development, that girls' brains develop earlier than boys. That's clear and uncontested. And in particular, and that seems to be because they hit puberty earlier, which triggers the brain development in many parts of the brain. And in particular, the prefrontal cortex, the so-called CEO of the brain. So this is not really, it's not about intelligence. It's about these non-cognitive skills. So the prefrontal cortex is the bit of the brain. And I'm not a neuroscientist, Raj, so I'm gonna defer to you on this, but tell me if I get this right, which is that's the bit of your brain that has you turn in your chemistry homework, that remembers you have chemistry homework, that remembers that you're in a chemistry class, that remembers to go to school, that goes to bed, that in other words has a bit more impulse control, that actually a bit more future orientation. It is the planfulness bit of your brain. And that bit of the brain grows about a year or two earlier in girls than boys in adolescence. And so in adolescence in particular, there's this big developmental gap on average between boys and girls. So on average, a 16-year-old girl is as developed as a 17-year-old boy in terms of that aspect of their brain, which is, I think, critical. Not I think, it clearly is critical for educational success. But we treat them as if they're the same. And so my proposal is we should just by default start boys in school a year later so that they're a year older.
So the other thing you're saying is that this educational advantage that women seem to have over men today is so vast or so deep that in some universities seem to be discriminating against women to try and make sure that the whole campus isn't just full of women and there's no men there. So they actually have to start discriminating against women to get some men in. Is that right? I think that's what you were saying in the book.
That's true. Yes, in the US, that's true. They have to be very careful about it. Some colleges have more legal room to do that than others. Public universities really have to be very careful about potential sex discrimination cases because very strong sex discrimination law in the US. But the private ones have a bit more room. And they are clearly discriminating in favor of men, everything else equal, to try and remain close to 50-50. I think in the UK, it's pretty hard to actually do discrimination based on sex as a matter of law. So instead, what happens is that there's just kind of more encouragement. There are various ways that you can take into account the broader context of a student's background. And you're not going to say, okay, I'm letting him in because he's a boy, not a girl. But it does look to me as if everything else equal, boys are a bit more likely to get into college than girls because colleges are terrified that if you get past about 60-40 female to male ratio, it starts to make it less attractive, not only for men to apply to that university, but also to women. Because they don't want to be in an environment where there's like only one guy for every two girls. For all kinds of reasons, that's not great for them, not least in the romantic marketplace. And so colleges are desperately trying in one way or another to try and reduce this trend. But it's the thing is they're fighting the tide because girls are coming out of secondary school so far ahead of boys that it's just impossible to do very much except at the margins.
So it's an important point to make that you're not arguing in the book that universities are having to discriminate against women because in some sense they just are pro-male. They're just really very worried if they don't do that, the university will be almost entirely female, basically. And they're just trying to avoid that outcome.
Yeah, they're definitely, I mean, most of the universities that are doing this are very, very liberal. They're very left. They're not. These are not conservative institutions who've got a sort of men's rights agenda. They are admissions officers who are terrified about seeing a decline in admissions. So it's more, frank in the US anyway. It's much more of a business decision. You've got to be careful about not becoming less attractive as an institution by becoming too female skewed.
So going back to your point about suicide, and there are statistics in the book about the very high rate of suicide amongst men, particularly at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. I think these are often termed deaths of despair because a couple of economists wrote a book about that issue, that the economic turndown had led to a big jump in deaths of despair, particularly men at the bottom of the socio-economic rung. And you mentioned feeling useless and worthless. So one counter argument to your position would be it's inevitable that if women come into the workplace more, come into universities more, men are going to do less well. But you're saying this isn't just an effect that women are recorrecting a balance. Women are leapfrogging ahead of men at such a dramatic level that we have to be more worried about this than this is just an inevitable statistical correction that men are going to do worse as women come forward and replace men in the workplace and universities. Something has happened whereby women have slungshot themselves into a position where men are in grave danger of being written out of the story almost completely. That's the thrust of your argument, I take it.
Certainly that's true in education. I think that slingshot argument is absolutely true. And nobody predicted it. Nobody predicted this great overtaking, which has happened everywhere. I mean, every OECD nation now, there are more young women with a college degree than men. And in most places, it's quite a big gap. Whereas you have to go back 40, 50 years, it was the other way around. And I do think it's important. Nobody expected the overtaking. Everybody was pushing for gender equity. No one thought, well, what if the lines just keep going? What if we do get this slingshot that you just saw? So that means that educationally, there has been this massive reopening of gender inequality, just the other way around. The story in the workplace, I think, is a bit more complicated because there's obviously still something of a gender pay gap, and maybe we'll get to that. Largely, I think, because of child rearing. In their 20s, women have basically caught up with men in terms of earnings now, but still there's this disproportionate effect of family life on earnings and on employment. And so in the labor market, the biggest story, I think, is the deindustrialization and free trade effects, particularly of the 80s and 90s, just disproportionately affected male jobs. So male jobs have been hit harder by the economic trends of recent years. And that's not because women entered the labor market. It's because of other things. But it happened at the same time. So it's very important not to believe that there's some lump of labor theory and that women are somehow crowding men out of jobs in the labor market. That's not happening. What's happening is that male jobs are declining and female jobs are rising. And as women have entered the labor force, they've actually been able to get into more of those jobs, and then to get into jobs, particularly higher ranking jobs, which were previously male domains, like medicine, like law. I mean, even in politics now, a third of MPs are women. And when Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, it was 5% of MPs were women. And so we've seen this really extraordinary progress into some of those higher ranking things, but that's called equality. And that's not a problem. I think it's good news that we have a higher percentage of female MPs, even though by definition that's a zero-sum game. It means we have fewer male MPs. That's equality. What I'm worried about is the men who've been hit by the successive shocks in the economy, which has had knock-on effects for their family life and so on too. And that's why I'm so focused in particular on, as you said, the guys at the bottom rungs of the ladder.
So people on the right of the political spectrum would argue that we've got to try and understand what's going on here, even if they buy your analysis, and it's a very persuasive analysis. The book is full of very impressive statistics that men are falling behind and we should worry about men and think about policies that address that. And there's a kind of political unfashionableness, which is one of the things you're trying to say in the book, about the idea that we need to think about looking after men, because that was kind of like we should have been looking after women all along. So there's a kind of oil tanker that has to be turned here that is having difficulty turning, and your book is one of the advance guards in trying to make that point. But the people on the right of the political spectrum who tend to believe that the individual is what matters and people got to pull themselves up by their socks, they would say whatever is going wrong with you in terms of your analysis, what men are doing wrong, they've got to fix it themselves. If men at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder are no longer required to lift heavy stuff because that job doesn't exist anymore, and instead they have to get into a call center and be nice to people on the phone, because that's the new job, the new service sector, that's what women are doing, then they need to learn to do that. So what's wrong with that answer? Men need to learn to raise their game and adapt to a slightly more feminized world and learn these skills and therefore fix the problem that way. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the quick answer is that it understates two things in particular. One is the difficulty of adaptation. It is difficult for people to adapt from one kind of occupation to another, from one world to another. And so we shouldn't be cavalier about how hard that is. And so if there is an adaptation necessary, we should help men to make that to bring about that adaptation. And secondly, we shouldn't, and we'll come back to this no doubt, but we shouldn't underestimate the fact that there are on average some differences between men and women in terms of their personality types and their psychologies. And so that does lead to some differences in occupational preferences. And it's true that to the extent that there are differences, say in certain soft skills, agreeableness, etc., that actually the jobs that require those are going to be on average a bit more attractive to women than to men, whereas the jobs that are more about things are going to be on average a bit more attractive to men. But actually, the thing I would correct is that it's not just the right doing it this time. It's very commonly the conservative argument will be pull yourself up by your bootstraps, individual responsibility, sort yourself out, Sonny, basically. But interestingly, they're joined in a different way by the left, who also say this is individual. It's about the boys or the men themselves. And so in different ways, both sides describe the problems of men as a problem with men or of boys. And I'm struck, actually, a report just came out in the UK, the State of Boys report, which was published at the RSA a couple of days ago, and it's a feminist document. And I've just been kind of looking through it and, trying not to become incredibly angry and show lots of toxic masculinity by getting really angry and aggressive. But it's a horrible document. And one of the reasons it's horrible is because it basically just says any problems that boys and men are having is because of masculinity. If they could just stop being so masculine, they'd be fine. And if they would if they just became good feminists and stop being so risk-taking and aggressive and interested in things, if they could basically become women and feminists, they'd be fine. And it just completely misses the mark in terms of lots of boys and men. But what's striking about it is it has the same structure of argument as the one you just gave, which is from the right, which is located at the level of the individual. And I'm not denying individual responsibility, but I see structural challenges facing boys and men. And so the result is that from both sides, there's a hell of a lot of finger wagging, but not very many helping hands being extended.
So we've talked about the problem in the education system. Men are falling behind. Men are not getting degrees at the same rate at which women are, and universities are having to discriminate against women to just get some men in through the door. And we've talked a bit about the workplaces changing and people, particularly men at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder, having more difficulty finding work in the workplace and therefore are in trouble as a result of that. But what I want to do is ask you a little bit about culture. You're at a dinner party. What is it to be masculine in a social setting? There's a sense in which I think men are feeling, I think in your book, the argument is culturally rejected as well. What is it as a red-blooded male with testosterone coursing through your veins, you're in a bar, there's an physically attractive, I'm going to get myself into trouble now, but anyway, as I'm saying this, there's a physically attractive woman there. Your male instinct is to chat her up or flirt with her. And men are now confused or finding it very difficult to figure out what it is to be a man in that environment, because the male instinct is now labeled as creepy or sleazy a lot of the time. So men are made to feel in wider culture that there's something wrong with them just for being men, in the sense of not men going up aggressively sexually assaulting people, but men pursuing the male instinct, which is to be competitive and to be pursuant when dealing with a physically attractive young woman, but not in a way that might be seen as rude or boorish. So what are your thoughts about that point, that there's a real question about masculinity being disapproved of or redundant in the wider social or cultural world?
Yeah, I think it's a great example of a specific example of a broader question, which is, what's good about masculinity? Right? Is there anything good about masculinity? And this is the whole problem with the debate about toxic masculinity, is that the users of the term usually fail to have any definition of non-toxic masculinity that is in any way distinguishable from femininity. So basically it's toxic or female. And that's the problem with the way that the debate is framed. And Actually, first of all, Raj, say I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm very happily married, have been so for many decades. So this scenario of I'm trying to imagine it now. I'm in a bar and there's an attractive woman who I'm attracted to. I guess it's feasible. I guess it's plausible. So let me imagine I could be that guy. And I should say I've got 3 boys, all in their 20s. So that helps me with the question. As so often with these things, it's about finding this balance, this middle ground that accepts that there are, on average, some differences in the way that, say, men and women are going to approach the question of flirting or asking somebody out, but in a way that is respectful and egalitarian. But we don't have to become androgynous in order to be equal. And I've certainly tried to raise my boys such that they have the courage to ask a girl out. And that could be in a bar, it could be somewhere else. The grace and self-confidence to just accept no for an answer respectfully and graciously, but then also a pretty strong sense of responsibility to make sure that either way she gets home safely, right? And right there, you've got a whole series of kind of differences, I think, between the approach, but also the respect, etc. And I came across this quote ages ago from the headmaster of Stowe School, J.F. Roxburgh. It's about 100 years old now, this quote, where he said he was trying to create young men who would be acceptable at a dance and invaluable in a shipwreck. And I was asked recently, someone said, "Can you update that?" And I was thinking, I don't know, like at a rap part, a dance. I don't, and I end up saying, look, it's fine. Everyone knows what that means. Acceptable at a dance, which means you've got these manners. You understand, like, what are the boundaries. What's the negotiation here? But also, yeah, if the ship's going down, you're going to show some physical courage and you're going to actually kind of step up. And so it seemed to me that's not bad. It's 100 years old, but it's not a bad definition of kind of positive aspects of masculinity because you have learned how to be in a social environment. And most people, I think, including most women, don't want a world where men feel as if even asking the question or flirting in an appropriate way is toxic, and that we should basically try and sandblast all of society of any of these interactions, right? We should just become androgynous, sexless creatures, right, wandering around in the world, and then the guys go home and log on to Pornhub, right? Do we want that world? Because men are attracted to women, and sometimes they'll want to express how they're attracted to a woman. And the trick is to learn how to do that in a way that is pro-social, in a way that's respectful, but frankly, in a way that might work. I mean, that's the key thing, right? And so there is this ground between sexless androgyny and sort of Donald Trump style pussy grabbing, or worse, or kind of assault, which is disrespectful of women. And because of the fear of the latter, we exclude the former. But that's really not the world most people want to live. Most people aren't like these culture warriors. I mean, most people are fine with a guy asking a girl out as long as he can take no as long as he does so respectfully and take no for an answer. That doesn't seem to me to be that difficult.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's a slight danger that some people listening to this will say we're being a bit heterosexist, and obviously there's gay relationships, but there's still a sense in which the question of masculinity and femininity applies, obviously, in gay relationships as well. But isn't one of the problems?
Yes, but actually, let me interrupt you there, Raj, because actually, isn't that a great example? I mean, if you want an example of the differences in biology, particularly around things like sex between men and women, look at the lesbian and gay communities. Like, go to a gay bar. And so I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence we now have for the fact that there are differences on average in the expression of, sex drive and the expression of sexuality and the approach, the psychology of sex between men and women is the lesbian and gay communities and how different they are to each other. And so that's a great thing. That we now have those different cultures, but it's just impossible to deny once you've got that evidence in front of you that maybe there are some, maybe men and women are a bit different about sex, right? Because you only have to spend any time in those communities or have friends in those communities to think, yeah, it is different. I don't know a single gay man who would deny that men are a bit different to women when it comes to sex.
Yeah, okay. But let's go back to the shipwreck example. The Stowe headmaster is talking about being useful in a shipwreck. Isn't one of the problems with masculinity the notion of heroism requires physical danger? The more you live in a safe world, the more there are no shipwrecks, as it were. There's a real problem about the exhibition of physical courage. So what men tend to do is they may seek out dangerous sports and ways of demonstrating heroism or physical courage in those scenarios. But as we live in a safer and safer world, what it is to be masculine, that physical courage isn't the only aspect of masculinity, but clearly it's a very important aspect of it for the Stowe headmaster to mention that example becomes problematic. How does one demonstrate masculinity? So what are your thoughts about that? There's a real problem the safer the world is. So we have to almost seek out danger in a mock sense or a proxy sense in order to demonstrate masculinity.
Yeah, well, it's a great example, I think, again, of this broader question. So if we know that one of the big differences between men and women is this risk taking, the appetite for risk, and that's been shown just, every study, every society. Obviously, the distributions overlap, but that one actually is one of those distributions that doesn't overlap quite. That's quite a big difference in the distributions. And there are obviously negative aspects to that, right? The sorts of risk taking, the sort of risks that I took as a teenage boy make me shudder now as a father, looking back on it. And so there's this risk-taking stuff that can lead to some dangerous behaviors, particularly among teenage boys, which we really have to help them to try and avoid those risk-taking behaviors. So there's a negative aspect to it, but there's also a positive aspect to it, which is that you can show physical courage. So in the US, there are these Carnegie Hero Awards, which are for civilians that have given or risked their lives to save the lives of another, not as part of the job and not as not close family. And they all go to men, like 95% of them go to men. They're trying to find women. But if you want to find a 16-year-old that's run into a burning building to save, a mother and her child and lost his own life, it's a guy. Just always 16-year-old guy, just 18-year-old guy died drowned. This is all these really wonderful stories, tragic stories, but of men being willing to risk their lives. Look in the Ukraine now at the men who turned back at the border and went back to fight. And so there are positive aspects to that physical courage too. And Margaret Mead famously said, we have to find a way for men to show, I can't get the first bit exactly right, show valor or show heroism, might have been even a word, in a world where dying for one's country is no longer feasible. Now, I think not a world where we're not dying for our country is a better world, but it doesn't mean we've expunged some of that requirement. And it could be through sports. It could be through competitive sports. I think that's one avenue, one potential way to express it. But I will say, make a broader point, which is I think what we're getting at here is something around courage. There's something about courage generally. And courage doesn't have to just be physical. What about the courage of your convictions? What about, we just talked about the courage to ask a girl out, right? It turns out that for a lot of women, that's quite attractive. Even, just like the willingness to take, why? Because it shows courage. So standing by your opinions, being willing to ask someone out, maybe on sports, etc. So my broader point is that we shouldn't think of that. If courage is a masculine virtue, and I'm going to say it is, not restricted to men, but it's a masculine virtue, then finding ways to show courage is very important in society, not just physically, but more generally, and then celebrating it when it is done, rather than trying to expunge it as a sort of last relic. I sometimes worry that masculinity is being treated by it like an appendix. We just, some relic of a previous era that we could, just take it out. We could have an appendectomy, a masculinectomy, or whatever it would be. And instead, what we need to do is recognize that, there's some real stuff here. The question is, how is it expressed?
So I want to stick with this point about physical danger and heroism. You make a very good point that all measures of physical courage, like medals for valor, tend to be overwhelmingly won by men. Men run into a burning building, and men are firemen and often policemen, and they often run into a burning building and pull someone out. But there are other measures of courage, you're quite right, but those other measures, for example, looking at organ donation, a living organ donation, so you're alive and well, and you donate one of your kidneys to someone in your family who needs it, which is another form of courage, right? But it's a quieter kind of courage, or quieter kind of heroism, and it's not going into a burning building. And as far as I'm aware of the research into that, women score higher than men. Women are much more likely to donate a kidney than a man is. So it's interesting that I still think that the more you move away from physical danger, although I take your point, we've got to find another way, the more you're going to have trouble being masculine. And I think I play a lot of tennis. There were two guys hitting a tennis ball next to me on the tennis court, and they were really whacking it very hard at each other. And there was something incredibly masculine about that. They were doing it really well. I mean, it was skilled. It wasn't just they were whacking it out of the park. So women find that boring. You have to be dominant as a man and competent. There's a lot of research that if you're dominant but incompetent, that's a real turnoff. But there was something about the raw masculinity about the way they were hitting that ball, which I thought was an interesting proxy measure, because they could have been beating the hell out of each other as well, in a sense of the demonstration of physical prowess. But the fact they were firing a ball at each other is a good proxy measure of masculinity, I think. So we've got to find things like that. You mentioned sport, and I think I work in private practice in Harley Street, and I always ask, obviously, because it's expensive to come and see me, generally speaking, people are successful. I ask people what they do for fun. And it is interesting how professional people, particularly men, see sport as trivial. And I have a catchphrase, which I hope to trademark at some point, is we need to take fun seriously. And I think there is something about the expression of masculinity that occur through sport, which is extremely important and actually culturally really important, given that the more we have less physical danger. I like to tease people because I go clay pigeon shooting and I have a shotgun. There's a kind of mock seriousness to my comment. I often say, because I'm quite into playing sport, tennis, I play other sports, but when I mention the shotgun, I say that the only sports worth doing are ones where there's a real possibility of death, as far as I'm concerned. Now, obviously, it's a slight mock joke, but I also think there's a sense in which a masculine idea is being expressed there, but not hopefully in a witty, not in a boorish sense. There's something about that landscape of what it is to be a man in a safe, comfortable world that I think we need more answers to. Again, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm thinking about my own experience of hitting a tennis ball very hard at my middle son, who's a very good tennis player, and it's great. So I'm having it, but I'm also thinking about, like, for quite a while, I was playing squash every Saturday morning against a friend of mine. It was a regular thing, like at 9 a.m. and we were very closely matched. It was gladiatorial.
There we go.
Really, it really had that feel to it. And actually, we both read, Ian McEwan has a novel called Saturday, which is about two friends who play squash every Saturday. I think they're both doctors, actually. I don't know if you know the novel, but it's very good. I recommend it. And it turns out that one of them's sleeping with the other one's wife, and so it gets very, very complicated. But and it's kind of similar thing. It was kind of very, very physical. And I got very interested in the research on this around testosterone. And what I discovered was there's a relationship between a testosterone spike and winning. This is obviously for men, and winning some sort of athletic duel like the tennis thing, or in my case, squash. But interestingly, the testosterone spike occurs after the win. And so clearly there's some testosterone going on during the battle, but you get the biggest spike is kind of on winning, right? And it was so interesting that both of us would say to each other, once we'd won, we'd be like, we felt really, really good now. Like maybe we're going to go home, and maybe we'll wink at the wife, and who knows what will happen. And it became a bit of a standing joke. But actually, I saw the research that we were actually experiencing a testosterone spike, right? And so we were thinking like that. And I find that stuff really interesting. And I do think that the physicality, I mean, this point about danger, I think the danger can be of different levels. Mm-hmm. But I think the sheer competitive physicality that we're talking about here is much more commonly found in men, for sure, is a much greater need among men on average, for sure. It's one of the reasons why our education system just has to have much more sport, much more movement, etc. And what we don't want to do is pathologize as somehow toxic or problematic highly physical, highly competitive duels. I used gladiatorial earlier, right? Between men, because that's to some extent how we are wired. And to deny that means we stop seeking opportunities and looking for places and spaces for men to express that aspect of themselves, which just leaves it with what it has to go somewhere, right? And so, and unless you're really committed to the fully blank slate socialization, unless you really think you can somehow just suck all the masculinity out of these guys at the age of 8 or whatever, and send them out into the world as good feminist allies, unless you're fully committed to that view, you've got to say, okay, boys are more physical, men are more physical, right? And they're more competitive on average. Let's do something about that. Like, we're not sending them to war anymore. We certainly don't want them to be expressing that aggression kind of out on the streets or in gangs or whatever. So, okay, so where's it going? But unfortunately, the state of the current debate is that you can't even ask that question, because the question presumes that there's a real thing there that's in male biology and in male psychology, and too many people are denying that.
Yes, and I'm going to bring up another example, which is going to make you run screaming from the room, and we'll have a debate about it. But if we don't have functional examples like playing tennis or football, men will go to the pub, and their way of expressing masculinity will be who can drink the more under the other person under the table, right? Or it will turn into football hooliganism, etc., etc. So I agree, but culturally we need to be thinking about this. I'm going to hit you with another example. I'll be interested in this reaction, but I think you're going to run screaming from the room. So my wife and I do this Latin American dance called bachata. It's not salsa, but it's not far away from salsa. So once you do any formal dance, the tango, the foxtrot, which is very old-fashioned now, but any of the modern Latin American dances, which is coordinated, what's really interesting is the man leads. Okay, that's the rule. They tried to experiment, by the way, with creating dances where the lead would change, and it was chaos. Basically, someone's got to lead, and you could have the woman leading, but generally speaking, because the man's taller and has slightly more physical strength, the man leads. It's really interesting. You enter a kind of like retrogressive world when you enter formal dance, because they start off with the man is going to lead. The man's going to make you do this. He's going to apply pressure on your shoulder, and then you will move here, etc., etc. And great Latin American dancing, or any dancing, the man's flinging the woman around in a very physical sense, but in a cooperative sense as well, right? So there's an example, I would argue, where actually it works brilliantly for both genders. Because, I mean, if you've got a competent man who's able to dance competently, women want to be led on the dance floor. Actually, they'd like him to be competent, that's all. So that's another example. And that's a great way for me that if we did more of that, maybe taught ballroom dancing, and it's a very old-fashioned term, but it includes Latin American dance and bachata and salsa. If there was more of that, it was obviously in Latin American countries, which interestingly are a more macho culture, there's more of that. If we found ways of encouraging that, that's a way for men to express their masculinity, I think. But again, I thought that's an example that may make you run screaming from the room. What are your thoughts? Oh, have we lost the connection?
Yeah, that's. Oh, sorry, a slight delay there. But well, thank you for sharing that, Raj. That's great. Great personal insight into you. Is there video of this?
Yeah, there is. It's not a pretty picture. I'm not very good at it. I should warn you. I'm not very good. And my wife refuses to be led most of the time.
There you go. Okay, well, there you go. A microcosm of modern society. Well, that's a great. I did ballroom dancing as a boy. My mum made us do it because she thought it was necessary to climbing the English class ladder. She was from Wales and thought, well, if they can't cha-cha or waltz, they'll never get anywhere. So it's a really intriguing idea, but I like the example of it as like a space where it kind of makes sense for technical reasons, perhaps, to have this difference in the roles. And I can imagine a lot of what just might work just practically, but also the thing is that's interesting about that, I can imagine quite a lot of both men and women enjoying that, right? Because it reminds us that the guy is a bit bigger and a bit stronger. It is a space within which he can lead, and it's kind of romantic. It's kind of old-fashioned in some ways to have that kind of division. Here's the thing: that most people are perfectly capable of thinking two thoughts at once and feeling different ways in different environments. And I think that's great. It's a great example. I'd hate to see that change, because I'm just thinking about my own experience, right? So I would, if I do a dance like that, or I'm dancing with my wife, and perhaps I am leading or whatever. I'm not as good as you, Raj, but then that doesn't in any way mean that when you leave the dance floor that she can't be a CEO or a cabinet minister, or maybe my boss in some way, or that she's going to be the main breadwinner in the house. So, and that's the thing, is that we can do that. We can do both things at once. We can have spaces like that we don't have to just drive everything all the way down. Basically, we don't have to drive out every difference, every gender difference, or every space where men might have, even in this kind of small way, some kind of leadership role, or even like a protective role of some kind or another, because it is a recognition of that physical difference. So it's a great example, I think, of a space where most ordinary people would not only be fine with the fact that remains this sort of stereotypically male-female environment, but in some ways would probably welcome it, because it's something of a difference. It's different to the rest of society, and it's insulting, I think, to think that we can't change roles in different spaces, and we can't play different roles in different spaces.
So the dance example is a good example, in my opinion, of what therapy or treatment of the human condition requires, which is we need to go and perform an action, right? And one of the problems is people just think that change is we have a conversation and we just talk about stuff. So what are the actions that you think need to happen? You were a policy advisor to Nick Clegg and so on. So you're in the realm, I think, and I got that very strong sense from the book, in the realm of action as well. So what are your thoughts on what actions need to be taken? Maybe at a personal level. You've got 3 sons. You mentioned in the book that partly your worry about them is why you wrote the book. And what actions need to be taken at a societal level?
Well, at a personal level, we've covered some of this already, but I do think that always encouraged physical activity. I think that physicality is very important for everybody, but it's especially important for boys and men, young men especially. Just a friend of mine, when we kept having boys, said, "Well, boys are like dogs. You just have to run them out twice a day." And it's not quite as simple as that, but it stuck with me as kind of like, there is definitely a more physical demand around boys. So take that very seriously, and don't think there's anything wrong with physicality, and especially kind of competitive sports. We've really encouraged that with our kids. I think that's one thing. I do think that we've talked a bit about like having the courage of your convictions and being under your own steam, and trying to somehow seek your own path rather than just being buffeted around by what's happening in society. I think that's certainly important too. And we've talked a bit about courage already, so I won't say any more about that. The thing that I've really stressed is the sense of purpose and being under your own steam. Right? I think that's the thing. I see too many young men drifting now, because I think we have this very powerful new script for women, which is educational success, economic independence. We've torn up the old motherhood apple pie one, but we've torn up the old script for masculinity. We don't have a new script, and so that's a lot of men are just adrift. That's the sense of it. And so what I've always encouraged my boys to do is, and I think it's true for all young men, is like, have your projects, have your purpose, have your path, have the thing you're doing. And it's second order what that thing is. Right? It could be, what's that dance you do? There's
the bachata.
Bachata, right? Become a bachata instructor. And one of my sons became an esports coach for a while in Las Vegas. It doesn't, what it is less important than that it is a thing that's purposeful and driven. And so that's a message that I think we really strengthen strongly to young women now, right? About empowerment, but we should send it to men too. In terms of policy, I've already mentioned, I think, starting boys in school a year later is something we should really think about. But we also need a massive recruitment drive of male teachers. The fact there are fewer and fewer men in our classrooms, and certainly in the UK and definitely in the US, that's a huge problem too. Much more on vocational training, where the UK is a bit better than the US, more apprenticeships, because they really help boys especially. And as far as the employment market is concerned, and I'd be interested to know your views on this, really getting more men into what I call HEAL jobs in health, education, administration, and literacy, We've worked really hard to get women into STEM, but we now need to work equally hard to get men into HEAL. And in many of those areas, there's fewer men as a share of those professions. I don't know what the trends are for psychology in the UK, but in the US, there's been a sharp decline in the share of men in the profession. And that's a problem if you want a male therapist. I did better with a male therapist because of the issues that I was facing. And so I really worry at the fact that we just don't have enough men in those professions. I'd love your views on that one in particular. And then I can say a bit about fatherhood if you like, but the main point there is just, and I did work on this in the government, we want equal paid leave for mothers and fathers would be the main point. But I'd love your views on what seems to me to be the feminization of some professions. Just as we're seeing other professions become less gender segregated, we're seeing some become more gender segregated, like teaching and maybe like psychology, therapy, etc. And that's a huge problem, I think, particularly for the boys one. Is that true? Is that true as well?
Well, medicine is becoming very feminine. I mean, again, I think medical schools in the UK have to discriminate against women to get any men in through the door, because women, you have to have very, very good A-level results to get in. And also you've got to be very personable in the interview. And the women have turned up, have got, fantastic results. And they've all done volunteer work at hospitals, you know what I mean? And did volunteer work for Médecins Sans Frontières and so on. I mean, they just got a glittering CV, and the guys are not competing at any level in any of that. So it's very difficult, ironically enough, because when I went to medical school in 1979, a long time ago, the medical school I went to was quite feminine. It was about 50-50, and it was just about reaching 50-50 then. Okay, but that was, historically, medicine had been a very male thing. Surgery is still quite male. I think women surgeons complain that they're having difficulty penetrating that territory. But psychology is incredibly female. When I did my psychology degree at University College London, I think in a class of 100, there were like 15 to 20 men, I think. And I think it's maybe even worse now, I think. So there is that. But I want to drill down again to the micro bits of what it is to be a male or a female, and the feminization of the profession. So classically, what women do is said better than men, and I don't want to get myself in trouble again, is they're better listeners, for example. So they're more they're more happy to be passive in a conversation and let someone vent and download. So that's great if you're that kind of psychologist or therapist. And men classically are more impatient and find it difficult to just sit and listen and want to get their oar in and want to speak or say something or intervene or give advice, whereas women are better at holding back from the notion of intervention. Yet I think women value men in a conversation, because men will often say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can we just what you try? Can we just get to the point that you're trying to make? And they can be more interventionistic, and that women can actually value the fact that if there isn't a man sometimes in the conversation driving it forward, it can be a little bit flabby. So I like to focus on which elements of masculinity are valued by women, because women don't want to live in a world that is entirely feminine. There is something about masculinity they value and are attracted to. But we've got to drill down a little bit more that's into the finesse bit of what that's about.
Yeah, well, that's a great example maybe of this sort of a yin and yang type argument, right? Which is that actually there are advantages and disadvantages to both, say, styles of conversation. And so a conversation that can involve both men and women might benefit. It will benefit from the advantages of both. So I think that is a really good example. But it's also a good example of this issue of overlapping distributions and these differences on average, and how that plays out into, say, occupation, etc. And so you just said classically women are like this, classically men are like that. And I think that the reason you're saying that, using that modifier, is because you know that's not true of all of them. What you're basically saying is, just saying it in a more straightforward language, is that the distributions overlap. So even if there's a difference on average, say in that conversational style, there are plenty of women who have a masculine conversation style and plenty of men who have a feminine one. It's just on average, and the reason that matters is because, first of all, it means we have to treat every individual as an individual and recognize there's a huge amount of variation within the distributions without requiring sameness. And so when that comes to something like an occupation, like psychology, you say classically women are better at listening. Okay. So what that means is the distributions are different in terms of listening ability, say. And if listening ability is a core competence for psychology, which let's assume it is, then that means that you're going to have more than 50% of psychologists are going to be women, right? If people are choosing occupations based on those differences, more than 50, but will it be 95%? Right? Do we really think the distributions on that skill overlap so little that only 5% of men? I mean, in early years educators, it's only 3% of men. There are almost no male childcare workers. In fact, the recent study by the Office for National Statistics was doing a survey of childcare workforce in the UK. They couldn't find a single male childcare worker in Northern Ireland. Not one. It was like a zero. Now, do we think the distribution of nurturing, say, between men and women in Northern Ireland doesn't overlap at all? There are no nurturing men? No, it's crazy. And so in just the same way that it was crazy to say that because women on average are a bit less interested in, say, things than people, we won't get, that's why they can't be engineers, right? And so, of course, only 5%, 3% of engineers are women. It's because they don't think like that. We can make the same mistake the other way around too. And so what it means to me is we're not going to be the same. There are going to be differences. Those differences are on average, and we should celebrate those differences. We should acknowledge those differences without them becoming deterministic or determinative. All right, and allow people to be different. Even among my own 3 boys, there's huge differences in their personality types. Right, I'm very high on agreeableness. Right, so which is more typically a kind of feminine trait. I'm much higher on that trait than my wife is. Right, I'm much more. I mean, I'll get in trouble now, but I'm more agreeable than my wife.
Right? Very dangerous statement to have made.
We have to hope to God that neither of our wives watch this one, Raj.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
But it's a good example of just like that these different. Some people make the mistake of thinking that distributions have to be exactly the same to have equality, and other people make the mistake of thinking that they don't overlap at all. The real world is a world of gloriously overlapping distributions.
Okay, now we're running out of time. We've only got about 4 minutes left, so I want to put one final point to you. Biography of John Stuart Mill, an amazing, slightly maybe forgotten philosopher, but wrote a famous essay on liberty. You can correct me if I get any of this wrong. And one of the deep points he's making, which is really relevant to today's world, is that we shouldn't cancel people or just shut out people who have opinions that we find offensive. We should engage in a conversation with them because we can learn something, and also we learn something in challenging their points of view. Okay. Now, one of the problems is there is a ghettoization of opinion when it comes to male-female differences. So I'm going to get myself into trouble by giving you one example. Men who play tennis, particularly, and I hang out with professional tennis players, you cannot find a male professional tennis player, as long as there's no women in the room, right? So they can start being honest about their views on this particular subject, who agree that female tennis players, if they win Wimbledon, should win the same amount of money as the male tennis player. They do not agree with that for all sorts of reasons, okay? They can't say it publicly. They'll only say it to a bunch of guys, right? So there is something about the fact we can't have a conversation about male and female difference. One of the things I think is really valuable about the book, your book of Boys and Men, is it creates an opportunity to have a dialogue. Is that what you found as well? Because I was a bit worried about you when I read the book that you're going to have trouble because we can't have a conversation about many of these things. That's an example. Male tennis players cannot say to a female tennis player, I really don't buy this idea that the female winner of Wimbledon should earn the same amount of money as the male winner. And I'm not defending that point of view. I'm just stating that is a classic point of view about male tennis players. They'll never admit that publicly or admit that to a female or a female tennis player. So what are your thoughts in the 2 minutes you've got left to say something about that point?
Well, thank you for raising Mill. I hope my project is quite a Millian one in the sense of you want to bring the facts to bear and create permission for a debate on the substance rather than on the sort of the where does it put you in terms of your tribal identity. If the real problem here is if things are framed as zero sum, right? If you challenge the idea that they should be paid the same, you're an alt-right, misogynist, anti-feminist, whatever, right? Period. Right? Or you're on the, it's one or the other. So you can't have an argument on its merits. There is an argument on the merits of that particular one, as there is with many others. And let's see how the argument plays out. Mill's view was that, we complete our opinions by engaging with the opinions of others. But he also said that he described what he called it the deep slumber of a decided opinion. And what he meant by that was if you end up with kind of views that can't be challenged, they actually become very sleepy. They become very weak. And that actually we need to challenge these dudes. You need to have what is the argument for there being the same? There are good arguments on both sides of most debates, right? Back to the steel man thing. So let's have that good argument and not have an ad hominem dismissal of anyone who disagrees with you. And so engage with the argument, not the person, and presume the goodwill of your opponent. That's what gets lost in this cancel culture. And actually, in the end, truth seeking is what suffers as a result. So let's pay each other the courtesy of assuming the best and having an actual argument about the actual substance, rather than saying, whose side are you on? If you're ever asking whose side are you on, it's the end of the debate.
Richard, thank you very much for talking to us. It's been a wonderful conversation. Richard Reeves, author of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling and Why It Matters and What to Do About It. It's a brilliant book. Thank you very much, Richard, for talking to us today. Thanks.
Thanks, Raj. That was fun.